Namaskar, I'm Govinda, and with me is Meeta. It's 1978.
No, Govinda. We're margiis since the 1970s, early 1970s.
Early 70s. Okay, we met in Liverpool. Actually, I met Baba first when I was in the islands of the Azores in the Atlantic. At that time, I was in the newspaper, we were described as pirates, but actually I was looking for going along on an expedition. We'd sailed from England on a small boat in pursuit of some treasure, which was in the seas around this particular island. And then I read in a paper, which was partly talking about us, that there was a man called Sarkar in India, and he had this revolutionary theory called PROUT, and it listed some of the fundamentals of PROUT. And I thought, this is really interesting. Even though I was engaged in not engaged in meditation or at the time, I, in a sense, was searching. Of course, I was physically searching for gold, treasure. But the experience of traveling there had made me feel that even the thought of treasure, of gold, of finding it, disturbed the mind, because there were many different people on this boat, ex-soldiers, ex-Navy, a couple of builders I knew from Liverpool who I taught to dive. And some of them really behaved bizarrely. And we hadn't even gone into the water at that point. Anyway, we went into the water, but we weren't allowed to excavate. And we found some wrecks, and because the season was very short because of the weather in that region, we had to leave within a month or two. But this stuck with me, this idea of this man's revolutionary theory. So some years went past, and I was living in Liverpool and beginning to come to the end of a phase in my life and hopefully improve it by some form of meditation. I've been searching various paths. A storm of comets, and I saw 2 or 3 green comets go over the sky. And then the next day, a friend of mine came and said, oh, there's a tantric monk coming to give a lecture. This friend was a friend of someone who had what we call at that time a head shop full of Afghani and Indian pabula. And they advertised that this man, Acharya Karunananda, was coming to the city to give a lecture. Excuse me. Anyway, I missed that lecture for some reason. My friends went, and they all said he's going to teach meditation. So I heard about him, even though I'd never seen him. And I went along to a friend's house And then there was another guy there. He was also at my friend's house. And I was waiting for my friend to take us to the other venue where this monk was teaching meditation. And he was saying, his name was Perkins, became Amal. And he said, I'm going to the Hare Krishna place. I said, well, why don't you come over with me? We'll see what this guy's like. Okay, he said. So we went together. When our friend took us across the road, excuse me, this was in Princess Road, Liverpool, to a flat. And went in the flat, and in one room, it was rather dark, there was just a few candles, and this monk was sitting there doing meditation. And as soon as I walked in the room, the vibration hit me. And I thought, I don't know what this is, but I want this. His powerful vibration was attractive. And when he spoke, he taught us a little meditation, how to do basic meditation, and we did some meditation. And then he gave a talk. And the talk, of course, was in Baba's words. But all the things he said, I felt as though they were already in my heart. They were already in my mind. It wasn't something new to me. It was as if he was reading a part of my mind which I didn't have access before. Previously, when I'd ever visit some other organization, some other group or cult, there was always the attempt to persuade you into believing their ideology or their theories. But this was different. I knew that this was on a different level completely. This was something which was resonating in my deepest soul. So then we began. I was living at the time in what became the Jagrati. And there was a very charismatic brother called Hambi and his charming wife, Jyoti. And they'd been to India. They met Baba there, they got married there. And so they were there to bring Ananda Marga to England and Liverpool in particular. So that's how it began. I didn't get to see Baba until we went to Fiesch, when Baba had already been imprisoned for 7 years, had fasted for 5 of those years, and I had been part of a campaign to try and get him released, and a lot of other things had happened during that period. When we went to Fiesch, it was rather like, and I first saw Baba when he was arriving by car, from a field walk, I believe. But it was like seeing someone who was both unfamiliar, but very familiar. As if I'd known him for a long time. And yet he was both ordinary looking and charismatic at the same time. There was no brash gestures or feeling that he was, trying to impress. He was just going his own way. Of course, he had a big entourage, and that was strange to see a man surrounded by so many monks. But I knew the kind of system. And at that point, I saw Baba briefly, but I get the impression that somehow we connected on a level which was neither physical or mental. It was a spiritual connection. And Baba had this way of making me feel that he knew my mind, and he acknowledged certain things which no one else would know. Excuse me. Bodhisattva asked Baba to go to a certain place that you can see this glacier to a greater extent. And this was hearsay, this is what I heard, that he said, I've already seen it. And to me, it was a sense of the perceptiveness of this seemingly human, seemingly spiritual, seemingly extraordinary, and yet ordinary looking man. And then Baba was to give DMS in the hallway of this the gymnasium of this ski resort, which was brand new, newly built, pristine. So I was given a task as a volunteer in the VSS, which we dressed in sort of quasi-military uniform. And my task was to guard the door where Baba would enter the gymnasium for DMC. So I was posted at this door and left there. And it was a very, very cold night. But somehow it's pristine and crystal clear atmosphere of these Swiss mountains. All the stars were twinkling, and I felt as if I was on the edge of a monumental event I'd been waiting for all my life. And then when the car came, Baba got out the car and walked towards me and the door, which was quite daunting in a way. I didn't know whether to salute or give namaskar. And to this day, I can't remember which I did. But he was very gracious and courteous and paid some attention, if fleeting. And then I opened the door to this gymnasium, and it was as if one opened the door to a world of light. And the margiis were singing kirtan, and then suddenly as Baba arrived within that door, through that door into the gymnasium, the whole place erupted. And people were shouting, and it was obvious that the intensity of his presence was felt by many, many people. I saw Baba a couple of times on that occasion in Fiesch by going firstly on a field walk where Baba walked on a mountain path. A couple of things I remember, many things I don't remember of it, but I do remember Baba be giving us seat or some kind of seat, and he sat down and he was looking over the mountains, the Alps, and he pointed to a particular mountain. He said, "This mountain is like Kailash, and Shiva lived on Kailash." And then he went into the life of Shiva. Apart from the fact, I remember he said, Shiva had a yak whose name was Nandi, and he traveled extensively on this yak. And then he named some of the countries which were quite far-ranging, but I can't remember the list of those countries. Maybe they're listed somewhere. Another thing I remember was that Baba said, mountains make people honest. And I can't remember whether this was in relation to something Bodhishwara had said. Bodhishwara had mentioned that many country people lived here. They would put apples out and people would come and they would take the apples and leave some money. And I don't know if it was in relation to that, but it seemed to coalesce with that Baba mentioned that mountains make people honest. He also said, if you dig here, you will find dinosaur bones. And I don't know if it's done the same field walk, but he mentioned that the seed of human life came here from Mars, which was a dying planet. And I think he said by microvita, but it was a new phrase to me on which I'd never heard before. And consequently know of, in a sense that Baba has talked about microvita a lot. But suddenly there was the sense that he knew of the existence and the history of this planet Mars, one of our nearest planets, and that there was a human colony there, or there was an existence of human life there. And it seemed, from what he said, that life had to leave that planet because it was dying. And somehow, through this extraordinary, almost Star Trek-like event, the seed of life had come here. At 0 degrees, I think, he said. And it wasn't clear to me whether he was talking about here being in Switzerland, that this was the place where human life first started. But it seemed to me to be similar to the statement that if you dig here, you will find many fossils of dinosaur, as if he was indicating that this was a very special place and that perhaps human life came here and started here. Of course, there are many theories where life began in Africa and the Rift Valley, etc. But that was something, because of the profundity of that statement about Mars, that I thought, well, he is indicating something which is completely unknown to science. And everything he said was almost like a revelation of an unknown fact. We were walking along on a field walk, and I was not very far from Baba, but I had to say that, talking about stones, this stone came from Iceland. And there's a video somewhere where I started picking up stones and looking at them, because I was fascinated that, stones could move across continents. And there is also someone who followed up that theory and proved that stones can move across continents. But to me, that was, how would he know that? How would someone know the history of the movement of stones? And it was clear to me that he had a mind which was so expansive and so benevolent towards everything that he considered the life of stones as important as anything else. Ever since then, I've collected stones. I'm afraid I have a huge collection of stones from various places. And I feel they're my companions. But in a previous life, as it were, I've been a climber. So I suppose I identified with this idea that mountains make people honest. Stones have a life of their own. I think he said that within stones there is mind. And I'm trying to think of other events somewhere. We did get very close to Baba at one point towards the end of the retreat at Fiesch, where I wanted to invite Baba to London, but I knew that he made a previous commitment never to set foot in London. In fact, he had passed through London by plane and not disembarked, I believe. In relation to that, some years later, I went to India. It was either for Dharma Shamika or for another event, and was fortunate enough to go on a field work again with Baba in a very small entourage. It was in August, I believe, and Baba said, on this particular day, we would change to khaki. And he said previous to that, you did not know I was in the army. I can't remember whether he said in the British Army or the Indian Army. Anyway, he was in the army in India. He was a sergeant. And that was a complete revelation to me. I had no idea Baba had this, past. On this day, we would change to khaki, meaning the khaki sweaters, because it was becoming cool. And then he said to me, the British did some very, what was the word he used? Something like unfortunate things. It wasn't condemnatory, but he was indicating that he said, they used the principle of divide and rule. So the British divided and ruled wherever they went as colonial oppressors. And it was obvious that he knew I was English. He was speaking English. And he knew that I had a social conscience. And it was that which attracted me to Baba, really. His social conscience, his unrelenting truth as to revealing injustice and speaking out for those who did not speak for themselves or could not speak for themselves, against the caste system in India, against religious dogma, against the unjust suppression of women. And all of these things were in my heart, but Baba somehow revealed them with a great more eloquence. And I loved the way he would explain things, even differences in Fiesch particularly. He mentioned, what is the difference between rural and rustic? He said, now we are in a rural environment, but rustic is something different. Rustic is rather arcane. And so he had this mind which examined language, was particularly erudite in English as well as all the other languages he spoke. Had an expansive mind, but it was not, what he said was not bragging. It wasn't as if he wanted to gain any kudos from these facts. They were facts to be stated and absorbed and accepted for what they were, a revelation of something you didn't know. I can't think of any particular event other than once I was on guard outside the house where Baba stayed. I decided to sit on a rock and do some meditation, even though I was on guard duty. And at some point, someone pulled the curtain aside within the house. And I felt as if Baba was close and I was feeling his vibration and he was feeling mine. And that happened several times, that I felt close to him, even if I was physically distant. I remember one day in India, this is going off to a different time, we were waiting for Baba to come out of the house in Lake Gardens. And while we were waiting, playing kirtan, singing kirtan, and so on, a little scene unfolded on a ledge above, I think, the first floor. There was a little ledge and there was ivy on one side. And a mouse came out of the ivy. And then a second mouse. And then some little baby mice, whatever they're called. And I was kind of captured by this little scene. And then Baba came out, and of course, all the attention turned to Baba. And then he walked a few spaces and stopped and started talking to one Avatita. And then he turned around and he looked up at this ledge. And he started speaking to this Avatita about something on the ledge. And the Avatita had no idea. I could see from his expression, he had no idea what he was talking about. And then he sort of turned in a casual way, and I caught his eye. And it was as if he knew the scene which had been played out only a few minutes before he arrived. This was my impression. But it cemented a closeness that he knew the details of your mind. He enjoyed what you saw, he saw. And it was almost as if you were becoming a tool in his kit. Because of that closeness, feeling of oneness with him, there was a trust, there was a familiarity, there was a bond that was on a mental and spiritual level, irrespective of physicality. So when we left Fiesch, we drove back. There were many, some adventures on that trip, but Baba was going to Holland. So we went to Holland shortly after we got back to England. Meeta flew back because she had to be at school or something. And then we went to see Baba in this Jagrati, which was above a public house in Rotterdam. I remember the staircase was so steep. I believe that Baba said at some point, "Who brought me to this hell?" Because the staircase was less than 45 degrees. It was like this, and the steps were quite shallow. But Baba had not long come out of prison. His health must have been not premium, not optimal. But nonetheless, he had to come up and down the staircase. And one English margie had helped to renovate a room which became Baba's quarter. And at some point, they laid pipes so he could have a shower in his room. And the pipes fractured and they blacked out the pub below. Baba said at some point, "I know everything that went on in this room." And the publican wasn't very pleased. Anyway, another event that took place when Baba was going for a field walk. I happened to be down next to the car, quite close. And I knew Ramananda. He knew me. And Baba was going for the field walk. And Baba asked for Govinda from Amsterdam, who we'd obviously met a day before or some days before. So rather like a courtroom request, where's Govinda from Amsterdam? The call went out. Nowhere to be seen. So Ramananda said to Baba, "This is Govinda from London, Baba." Okay, so they pushed me in the car. And my memory is not clear, but it seemed to me that I couldn't have been in the same back row as Baba. I think I was in this, in this side with the driver. But I guess Baba picked up on my nervousness of being so close, and he said, "You know that Govinda from Amsterdam? He didn't know what was cowpats." And I knew what cowpats were, because I'd seen them in the country and I'd seen them in India. He said, we had to show him, we had to tell him, they're round and you can make a cake with them, as women in India do, and they put them on the wall to dry. He said, you can make a cake, but you can't eat it. And he said, they're round, a bit like a football, but you can't kick them. And I'm sure there was a third similarly, where he compared cowpats to something else. And I can never remember that one. But it was an icebreaker whereby he knew that I knew what a cowpat was. And he knew, I knew the difficulty of explaining to someone who doesn't know what a cowpat is. And at that time, I was given the post of PCAP secretary for the prevention of cruelty to animals. and plants. And Baba was asking various people, oh, do you know what this tree is? And people were looking around and not knowing and asking others, do you know what that tree is? So we can tell Baba we know this tree. And Baba pointed, this is an ash tree. He pointed to one tree. You can see from the black tips of the bud. And they would point to a different tree and give it the features of this tree, which very few people knew. And somehow it prompted in my mind that we were in Holland, where there's a vast industry of cut flowers. Holland is famous for it, especially in Europe. And it was a query in my mind, what should we think about this? I'm secretary of PCAP. Maybe I'll ask Baba a question, which wasn't the protocol. I led after, you're not supposed to ask Baba questions on people. So I asked the question, Baba, how should we regard this? We are in Holland and there is an industry for cut flowers. And Baba stopped, politely turned and looked at me. And of course, everybody else stopped. And when he gazed at me, it seemed like time stopped. He said, you know, my boy, I love each and every entity. And that was such a cosmic statement that I'd forgotten the question, even though it answered it in a different way that I had expected. And after some time, we moved on. But to me, it seemed like he'd given me a mantra to absorb and ideate upon. Although there was the organization, Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and Plants, he was benevolent towards every entity. And I felt that he wanted to impress that we should be benevolent to each and every entity and see the cosmic. And that has been my raison d'etre ever since, to be like him, to see everything as a manifestation of the cosmic mind.
What about where did you have PC?
I had PC in Rotterdam.
You had PC in Rotterdam?
Yeah.
Anything from that?
It was a very personal thing. I felt he understood my past. He told me a little about my past. And he said, be an ideal son. And I tried to live into that. But it was a feeling of intimacy that was a continuation of that relationship I felt was developing with Baba throughout. Even when he passed away, or his mind passed away from his body in India, I was there to witness. It was a sense that now Baba is released into the universe. It is our duty to do what he asked us to do, that his physical body was irrelevant to him. And all the past attention to him as a personality seemed to me to fade into the distance of how we could fulfill what he'd asked us to fulfill by his extensive ideology and his continual insistence, do something, do something, do something for the suffering humanity. And I felt that was the core of his ideology. Namaskar.
You haven't quite finished yet, do you? What about Dharma Samika and microbiota?
Well, I think you should have an opportunity to say things.